My sister stood up in the middle of a room full of people, lifted her glass like she was about to make a toast, and calmly told everyone I was the most toxic person in our family and that I didn't deserve a single dollar from our grandmother's trust. No yelling, no shaking voice, just clean, deliberate words. You ever have a moment where everything slows down but somehow gets louder at the same time? That was it. And if you've ever been blindsided by your own family, you already know how this feels. She didn't stop there. She set the glass down, looked straight at me, and said she had already taken steps to suspend my access to the trust. About $168,000, plus whatever it had grown into over the years. Said it like she was announcing a venue change for her wedding. Matter of fact, final. Like it had already been decided. The room went quiet in that way that isn't actually quiet. Chairs shifting, someone clearing their throat, forks pausing halfway to mouths. I didn't move. Not right away. I just looked at her. Brianna always had a way of performing when she thought she had control. Perfect posture. Slight tilt of the chin, that tight little smile that never quite reached her eyes. She was waiting for me to react. That was the point. She wanted the scene. I almost gave it to her. Almost. Instead, I glanced to my left. My mom was sitting 2 seats down, her fingers fussing with the edge of the tablecloth like it had suddenly become the most interesting thing in the room. Smoothing it out, then adjusting it again. Not looking at me. Not looking at Brianna. Just busy. That hurt more than anything Brianna had said. I looked at my dad. He stared straight ahead, jaw set, like he was watching something unfold that had nothing to do with him. Like this was just happening in front of him, not to his daughter. No interruption, no correction, nothing. That's when it landed, not the words, not the money, the silence. Brianna let out a small laugh like she was easing tension instead of creating it. I know this sounds harsh, she said, but someone has to say it. You've always made everything harder than it needs to be. There it was. Gaslighting wrapped in concern. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone from her fiancé's side leaned closer to the person next to them, whispering something I couldn't hear. Brianna kept going. You overreact. You complicate things. And honestly, you've never really been involved in managing anything important in this family. I almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny, because of how completely disconnected it was from reality. She gestured lightly with her hand, like she was explaining something obvious. I've been handling the trust. I've been making sure things are taken care of. And it doesn't make sense for someone who doesn't contribute to have access to that kind of money. Doesn't contribute. I let that sit for a second. Then I looked around the table. Faces I recognized, some I didn't. People who had watched me show up, help, fix, cover, adjust over and over again for years. None of them said a word. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands resting loosely in my lap. My heart wasn't racing. That surprised me. I thought it would. Instead, everything felt clear, like someone had finally turned the lights on in a room I'd been walking through in the dark. Brianna watched me closely, waiting, pushing. Say something, she added, her tone sharpening just a little. Or are you going to pretend this isn't happening like you always do? I tilted my head slightly. You're saying you can suspend access to the trust. I kept my voice even, not defensive, not emotional, just precise. She smiled. I already have. A small pause. Then she added, softer this time, like she was being reasonable. It's for everyone's benefit. Of course it was. I glanced at my mom again. She was still smoothing that same section of fabric over and over, like if she got it flat enough, none of this would be real. She didn't look up, not once. That was her choice. I turned back to Brianna. You might want to be careful how you describe your authority over something like that. The words came out calm, measured. They didn't land the way yelling would have. They landed differently. I saw it in her face. Just for a second. A flicker. Then it was gone. Her smile tightened. Is that supposed to be a threat? I shook my head slightly. No. I picked up my glass, took a small sip of water, and set it back down. It's just a fact. Silence again. Heavier this time. Because I hadn't given her what she wanted. No explosion, no defense, just resistance. She laughed, louder now, trying to pull the room back into her control. See, this is what I mean. always turning things into something bigger. No one joined her. That was interesting. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood. No rush, no drama, just movement. My napkin slid off my lap and onto the chair as I stepped away from the table. "You're not even going to argue," she said, her voice following me. I paused, turned slightly, looked at her. There was something almost eager in her expression now, like she needed me to stay in it, to fight, to prove her point. I held her gaze for a second, then I said quietly, "No." That was it. One word. And it landed harder than anything else I could have said, because it ended the performance. I reached for my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and started toward the exit. No one stopped me. Not my dad. Not my mom. Not a single person at that table. As I walked past, I caught a glimpse of my mom out of the corner of my eye. She finally looked up. Just for a second. Our eyes met. And then she looked away again. That was the moment that stayed with me, not what Brianna said, what she didn't do. I pushed the door open and stepped outside. The air felt cooler than it had when I walked in, or maybe I just noticed it more. The parking lot stretched out in front of me, cars lined up in neat rows, everything quiet in a way that felt almost unreal after what had just happened. I walked to my car, unlocked it, and got in, closed the door, sat there. My hands rested on the steering wheel, still steady. That surprised me again. I thought I would feel something bigger, anger, shock, anything. Instead, there was just clarity. Like a puzzle I had been staring at for years had finally snapped into place. I started the engine, but I didn't pull out right away. I just sat there, replaying it, not the words. The pattern. The way it had been building, the way no one interrupted, the way it all made sense now. I let out a slow breath, and for the first time, I didn't ask myself what I should have said. I knew exactly why I hadn't, because this wasn't something I needed to win in that room. This wasn't even a conversation anymore. It was something else, something quieter, more permanent. I pulled out of the parking space and drove away. No music, no phone calls, just the sound of the road under the tires and my own thoughts settling into something solid. By the time I got home, I already knew what I wasn't going to do. I wasn't going to argue, I wasn't going to explain, and I definitely wasn't going to ask for permission. I turned off the engine and sat there for a second, looking at my reflection in the darkened windshield. She'd made a very public move, confident, final, like she had already won. I almost laughed, not out loud, just quietly. Because she'd made the biggest mistake she could have made. She'd said it out loud, in front of witnesses, with complete certainty, and she had no idea what she was actually claiming. I opened the car door and stepped out, closed it behind me, locked it, and walked inside. 2 months later, she was the one being questioned. But that night, I drove home like nothing had changed. Charlotte traffic was the same. Red lights catching me at the same intersections. A line of cars inching forward like we all agreed to move slowly together. I stopped at a light on East Boulevard and realized my hands were still resting lightly on the wheel. Not gripping, not shaking, just steady. That surprised me. I should have been replaying everything, rewriting what I could have said, thinking of better responses. Instead, my mind was quiet, not empty, just organized. I pulled into my driveway, parked, and sat there for a second before turning off the engine. The house looked the same as it had that morning. Clean, still. The porch light casting a soft glow over the front steps. Nothing about it suggested that anything had shifted, but something had. I stepped inside, set my bag down on the chair by the door, and kicked off my shoes. Routine. That was the first thing I reached for. I walked into the kitchen, filled a glass with water, and leaned against the counter. The clock on the wall read 8:47 in the evening. I took a sip and stared at nothing in particular. Then my phone buzzed. I didn't need to look. I already knew. I picked it up anyway. 3 messages, all from Brianna. First one, "You left like that." Second, "Real mature." Third, "We need to talk." I let out a small breath through my nose. Of course we did. I set the phone down without responding. Then I walked over to the living room, turned on a lamp, and sat down. The quiet settled in around me again. This time, it felt different. Not heavy, not tense, just clear. I leaned back and closed my eyes for a moment, and that was when it started. Not the argument, the pattern, the way this had always worked. I saw it the way you see something after you finally step back far enough, not as individual moments, as a system. I opened my eyes and looked at the ceiling. I had always been the one who handled things. Not officially, no one ever said it out loud, it just became true. If something needed to be organized, I did it. If something went wrong, I fixed it. If someone dropped the ball, I picked it up. At first, it felt like responsibility. Then it became expectation, and somewhere along the way, it turned into something else entirely obligation. I stood up and walked back into the kitchen, rinsed out my glass, and set it in the sink. Another buzz. I glanced at the phone. Still her. Another message. You can't just walk away from family. I almost smiled. Because that was exactly what she thought this was. Walking away. It wasn't. It was stepping back. There's a difference. I ignored it. Opened the fridge, pulled out leftovers, heated them up without really paying attention. The microwave hummed. I leaned against the counter again, watching the numbers count down. 3 minutes. 2 minutes. Time always moves the same, no matter what just happened to you. I carried the plate to the table, sat down, and took a few bites. No appetite. But I ate anyway. Routine again. Across the table, the empty chair caught my attention. I used to sit there with my mom sometimes when she stopped by. Coffee in the morning. Quick dinners when she said she didn't feel like cooking. Those moments had always felt normal, comfortable. I thought about her at the reunion, the way she kept smoothing that tablecloth, not looking at me, not saying anything. That was her version of handling things. Minimize, soften, avoid, don't make it bigger. She'd always said that. Don't make it bigger than it is. I set my fork down. That sentence had followed me for years. Every time something didn't sit right, every time I felt that flicker of something, I would hear her voice. It's not that serious. You're overthinking it. And I'd adjust, step back, make room, because it was easier, because it kept things smooth. I picked up my phone again, scrolled through older messages, not just from tonight, from months back, years, if I went far enough. Patterns, requests that didn't sound like requests. Hey, can you take care of this? You're better at this stuff. It's easier if you just handle it. I tapped on one thread from about 6 months ago. Brianna again. We're meeting with the venue tomorrow. Can you look over the contract tonight? No question mark, just assumption. I remembered that night, sitting at this same table, laptop open, reviewing terms that had nothing to do with me, making notes, sending them back. She had replied with a thumbs up. That was it. No thank you, no acknowledgement, just expected. I scrolled further. Another one. The florist needs a deposit. Can you transfer it and I'll settle it later? Later never came. I knew that now. But at the time, I didn't even think about it. I just did it. Because it was easier than saying no. Because saying no would have made it a conversation. And conversations in our family had a way of turning into something exhausting. I leaned back in my chair, my phone resting in my hand. That was the thing. It wasn't one big moment. It was hundreds of small ones. Small enough to ignore, small enough to justify. Until they weren't. Another message came in, still her. You're blowing this out of proportion. I stared at the screen for a second, then I typed a response, not to send, just to see it. What proportion would make this acceptable? I looked at the words, then deleted them, because I already knew the answer. No proportion. Nothing would have made it acceptable. The problem was never the size of it. It was the assumption behind it. I set the phone down again, walked over to the sink, rinsed my plate. The water ran steady, the sound filling the space in a way that felt grounding. I dried my hands and leaned against the counter again. And that was when another memory surfaced. Not recent, older. I was probably in my early 20s, still figuring things out, still trying to prove I could handle myself. Brianna had just moved into a new place, boxes everywhere, furniture half assembled. She stood in the middle of it, hands on her hips, looking overwhelmed. I remember asking if she needed help. She laughed. Of course I do. You're better at this stuff than I am. I had smiled. Not because it felt like praise, because it felt like inclusion. Like I had a role. I spent the entire weekend there, building furniture, organizing, fixing things that weren't even broken yet. By Sunday night, the place looked finished. She hugged me at the door. I don't know what I'd do without you. At the time, that felt good. Now, it sounded different. Less like appreciation, more like expectation. I pushed off the counter and walked into the living room again, sat down. The house was quiet. My phone buzzed once more. I didn't pick it up this time. I just sat there, letting it ring, then stop, then ring again. Eventually, it went silent. I leaned back, resting my head against the couch, and I let myself sit with it. Not the anger, not the embarrassment, the pattern. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Helping had never really been a choice, not in the way I thought. It had been assigned, gradually, quietly, wrapped in compliments and softened with phrases that made it feel reasonable. You're just better at this. It's easier if you do it. Don't make it a big deal. I let out a slow breath. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to justify why something felt off. I didn't need to explain it. I didn't need to soften it. I just needed to recognize it. I sat up slightly, my hands resting on my knees, and I asked myself the question that had been sitting there, just out of reach. When did helping stop being a choice? I didn't answer it that night. I went to bed instead. Or at least I tried to. Sleep didn't come the way it usually did, not heavy and quiet, it came in pieces. Short stretches that broke apart every time my mind drifted back to the same place. Not the reunion, not Brianna standing there, the gaps, the things I didn't know. I woke up just after 6 in the morning, before my alarm, staring at the ceiling like I had already been awake for hours. The house was still, that kind of still that makes every small sound louder than it should be. I got up, walked into the kitchen, and started the coffee maker without thinking. Routine again. It always came back to that. I stood there while it brewed, arms crossed loosely, watching the slow drip fill the pot. And then, without really deciding to, I turned toward the hallway, the closet at the end. I hadn't opened it in months, maybe longer. It wasn't locked. Nothing dramatic like that. It just wasn't part of my daily life. I walked down the hall, pushed the door open, and flipped on the light. Boxes. A few shelves. Some old storage bins. Things I hadn't needed but hadn't gotten rid of either. The one I was looking for sat on the top shelf, smaller than I remembered. A simple cardboard box, slightly worn at the edges. I reached up, pulled it down, and set it on the floor. Then I sat cross-legged in front of it. For a second, I didn't open it, I just looked at it, because I already knew what was inside. Or at least, I thought I did. I lifted the lid. The smell hit first. Paper. Old wood. Something faintly familiar that I couldn't quite place but recognized immediately. Memories don't always come from thoughts. Sometimes they come from something as simple as a smell. There were photos on top, faded around the edges, colors softened by time. I picked one up. Me and my grandma sitting on her porch, late afternoon light stretching across the wooden floorboards. I couldn't have been more than 10. She was smiling at something off to the side, not at the camera. I remembered that. She never liked posing, said it felt like pretending. I set the photo aside and reached deeper into the box. Letters, cards, small things she had kept and somehow, eventually, passed on to me. And then I saw it. Folded paper, different from the rest, heavier. I pulled it out carefully. It wasn't a full document, not even close, just a fragment. A few pages, slightly yellowed, edges worn but intact. I unfolded it slowly. The handwriting caught my attention first. Not typed. Written. Her handwriting. Neat. Precise. Slightly slanted to the right. I traced a finger over one of the lines without thinking. I could almost hear her voice. Not loud. Never loud. Just steady. Clear. I leaned back slightly, holding the paper in my lap. And for a moment, I was sitting at her kitchen table again, years ago. She had a way of explaining things that made them feel simple, even when they weren't. Money, responsibility, choices. She didn't talk about them like abstract ideas. She talked about them like tools. Something you used, something you respected, not something you showed off. I remembered one conversation more clearly than the others. I must have been in my early 20s. Still figuring out what I wanted to do, where I wanted to be. She had poured us both coffee, set the mugs down, and looked at me in that quiet way she had. Not judging, not pushing, just seeing. People think money gives you control, she said. I had nodded, not really thinking about it. It does, I said. She shook her head slightly. No, it reveals who already has it. I didn't understand that at the time, not fully. She took a sip of her coffee, then added, softer. And the worst thing you can do is let someone else decide how it gets used without understanding why. I remember laughing a little. That sounds specific. She smiled. It is. I didn't ask more. I should have. I looked down at the paper in my hands again. There were names on it. Legal language, but not overwhelming. Just enough to outline something real. A trust. Established in 2010. That much I knew. Or thought I did. What I didn't know was everything else. I scanned the lines. Certain words stood out. Beneficiary, trustee, distribution. They weren't unfamiliar, just incomplete. Like reading half a sentence and trying to guess the rest. I flipped the page. There was a signature at the bottom. Hers. Clear, undeniable. And below that, another name. The trustee. I paused. Because I already knew who it would be, or at least who I had always been told it was. Brianna. That had never been questioned. Not by me, not by anyone. It was just accepted. She handled things. That was the narrative. That was the role. I leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on my knees, the paper still in my hands. Something about it didn't sit right. Not wrong, just incomplete. I had never seen the full document. Not once. Not when it was created. Not after. Not even when conversations about it came up in passing. It was always summarized, filtered, explained, never shown. I thought about that for a second, then longer. Because that wasn't normal. Not really. Not for something like this. I stood up, walked over to the kitchen table, and spread the pages out in front of me. The morning light came through the window, catching the edges of the paper, making the ink stand out more clearly. I leaned over them, reading again. Slower this time, more carefully. There were references to additional sections, clauses, details that weren't here, not missing by accident, just not included. I straightened slightly, and that was when the realization started to settle in, not all at once, gradually, like something coming into focus. Everything I knew about the trust had come through Brianna. Every explanation, every update, every decision, all of it. I had never gone around her, never asked to see it myself, never questioned why I hadn't, because it had been easier to let her handle it, because that was the role she had stepped into, and the one I had stepped back from. I exhaled slowly, set my hands flat on the table. That was the system, not written, not formal, but real. She controlled the information, which meant she controlled the perception, which meant she controlled everything else. I picked up the top page again, read the first line, then the second, and I noticed something small, a reference, not to her, not directly, to another party, another role. It was only mentioned once in this fragment, but it was there, clear enough that it couldn't be ignored. I felt something shift, not panic, not even anger, just awareness. Because if that role existed, if there was more to this than what I had been told, then everything about last night changed. Not emotionally, logically. I folded the papers back up carefully, placed them on the table, and stood there for a moment looking at them. This wasn't about the money, not really. It was about something else. Control. Information. Who got to decide what was true? I thought about Brianna standing in that room, speaking with complete certainty. Like there was no room for question. Like she had the authority to say what she said. And maybe she believed that. Maybe she had for a long time. But belief and reality aren't always the same thing. I picked up my phone, then set it back down. Not yet. I wasn't ready to ask questions. Not until I knew which ones mattered. I looked back at the papers one more time, at the handwriting, at the signature, at the pieces that were there and the ones that weren't. That was the part no one ever showed me. So I went looking, not dramatically, not all at once, just small things. The kind you only notice when you stop assuming everything is normal. It started with an email. Subject line was short. Vendor confirmation. I almost ignored it. It wasn't addressed to me. It was forwarded through a family thread. One of those chains where everyone is included, but no one is really paying attention. Except this time, I did. I opened it. The message was simple. Payment confirmed. Deposit received. Timeline secured. For a custom dining set. High-end. Imported. The kind of thing you don't buy casually. The amount was listed. Just over $12,000. I read it twice. Then I scrolled up. Brianna had replied earlier in the thread. Handled. She wrote, "Don't worry about it." That phrase. I'd seen it before. Too many times. I sat there for a second, phone still in my hand. Not reacting. Just placing it. Because that amount, it didn't come from her. I knew her finances, not in detail, but enough. And that was the moment something shifted. Not emotionally, logically. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask. I went back through the thread, further up, more messages, more confirmations. A lighting fixture, 6,000, a venue adjustment fee, 4,000, each one followed by the same tone. I've got it. It's handled. You don't need to worry. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because of how consistent it was, like a script she'd memorized. I opened my notes app, new document. I typed one line. Dining set, 12,000. Paid, then another. Lighting, 6,000. Then another. Venue adjustment, 4,000. No commentary, just facts. Because patterns don't argue, they accumulate. Later that evening, my phone buzzed. Brianna. I stared at the screen for a second before opening it. Hey, just making sure you saw the updates. Everything's under control. There it was again, under control. I typed back. Which account is covering those payments? The typing bubble appeared immediately, then disappeared, then appeared again. It's all part of the trust. Relax. I read that once, then again. Not because I didn't understand, because of how easily she said it, like it was obvious. Like it had always been that way. I didn't respond right away. I let a minute pass. Then I typed. The trust isn't yours to manage independently. 3 dots. Pause. Then. I'm not doing anything wrong. You're overthinking it like always. There it was. Gaslighting. Soft. Familiar. Effortless. I set my phone down. Didn't reply. Because this wasn't about convincing her. It was about confirming something. I went back to the notes, added one more line. Text. Trust used casually, no acknowledgement of structure. The next morning, I checked my email again. Another confirmation, this one smaller, but still, 2,000, decor rental. Same pattern, same tone, same assumption. And suddenly, it clicked, not the money, the timing. These weren't new decisions, these were ongoing. Weeks, maybe months. And no one had questioned it. Not my dad, not my mom, not anyone. Because in their version of reality, it made sense. Brianna handled things. I stayed quiet. And somewhere in between, ownership blurred. I closed the email, sat back. And for the first time, I didn't feel confused. I felt ahead. Because this wasn't happening in the moment. This had been happening long before I noticed. And that realization followed me straight into dinner. It was held at a place my mom liked. Quiet, polished, too many white tablecloths. There were people I didn't know. Friends of Brianna's fiancé. A couple from his side of the family. Everyone smiling, everyone relaxed. Like nothing underneath was shifting. I took my seat, watched, listened. Because by then, I wasn't guessing anymore. I was observing. The conversation moved easily at first. Wedding plans, travel, food. Then someone asked about the venue. Simple question. Excited tone. Brianna leaned forward slightly, confident. We upgraded a few things, she said, just to make it feel right. Of course she did. Someone laughed. Sounds expensive. She smiled. Worth it. I picked up my glass. Didn't drink. Just held it. Then one of the women across the table spoke up. Wait, I thought the trust was structured. Like limited access? The table shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. A small pause. Brianna didn't hesitate. It's flexible. I'm managing it. Managing. Not using. Not accessing. Managing. I set my glass down. Slowly. Then I asked, how are those decisions being approved? Not loud. Not aggressive. Just clear. The table went quiet. Not silent. But aware. Brianna turned to me. Smile still there. Tighter now. I told you, I'm handling it. I nodded slightly. That's not what I asked. A beat. Her fiancé shifted in his seat just slightly, enough to notice. My dad cleared his throat. It's family, he said. We trust each other. Of course. Trust. That word again. I looked at him, didn't challenge it, just noted it. Then I looked at my mom. She was adjusting her napkin, carefully smoothing the edge. Not looking at me, not looking at anyone, just busy. I waited. Nothing. No interruption. No correction. No support. That was the moment. Not when Brianna spoke. Not when my dad justified it. When my mom chose not to look up. The conversation tried to move on. Someone asked about honeymoon plans. Someone laughed too loudly, but the air had changed. The woman who asked the question didn't smile the same way anymore. Neither did her husband. Because once something doesn't make sense, you can't unsee it. I leaned back in my chair. Didn't push further. Didn't need to. Because the shift had already happened. Not for them, for me. I saw it clearly now. They weren't asking anymore. They were deciding, using, assuming, and expecting me to stay quiet while it happened. I stood up a few minutes later. Said I had an early morning. No one stopped me. Not really. Brianna said something behind me, about me being dramatic. I didn't turn around, because that wasn't the point anymore. Outside, the air felt different. Cooler. Cleaner. I walked to my car slowly, unlocked it, sat inside, hands resting on the wheel, still. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I needed to explain anything, not to them, not to myself. Because this wasn't confusing, this wasn't miscommunication, this wasn't a misunderstanding, so I stopped treating it like one. That night, I didn't sleep much, not because I was upset, because I was organizing. By morning, I had a list. Dates, amounts, messages, no interpretation, just sequence. At 8:20 in the morning, I opened my phone. Family group chat, muted, then removed. No announcement, no explanation, just gone. Then Brianna, blocked. Her number, her messages, everything. I stared at the screen for a second after, waiting, not for regret, for confirmation. It didn't come, just quiet. Clean. I made coffee, sat at the table, opened my laptop. Work emails, normal, steady, predictable. I answered 3 messages, reviewed a report, joined a call, spoke clearly, took notes, everything exactly the same, except it wasn't. Because for the first time, I wasn't carrying something extra in the background. Around noon, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I didn't answer. Voicemail came through. I listened. Her voice. Hey, just wanted to check in. Make sure you're okay. A pause. And then. Also, just making sure you didn't say anything to anyone yet. There it was. Not concern. Control. I replayed it once, then deleted it. No response. No acknowledgement. An hour later, another message. Different number. You're being really weird about this. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit. Because urgency tells you more than words. By mid-afternoon, there were 3 more. Shorter. Less controlled. We need to talk. Call me. This is getting out of hand. Out of hand. I almost smiled. Because for the first time, it wasn't me. I opened my notes again, added a new section. Post-dinner. Contact attempts. Concern masking verification. Then one more line. Escalation when ignored. I closed the file, leaned back, looked around the room. Everything in its place. Everything quiet. And I realized something simple. When you stop responding, people show you exactly what they were relying on. And in this case, it wasn't communication, it was access. To me, to my silence, to my cooperation. Without that, the structure shifted. Not publicly, not yet, but underneath. It had already started. That evening, I went for a walk, same route, same streets. Nothing changed, except me. Because I wasn't trying to make sense of it anymore. I already had. The problem was that making sense of something and doing something about it are not the same. I had the pattern. I had the timeline. I had the fragment from the box, with its names and signatures and references I still didn't fully understand. But all of that was mine. Private. Unverified. And if I went further, if I handed what I had to someone outside the family, there was no walking it back. Not because of what it would do to Brianna. Because of what it would do to what was left. My mom would find out. My dad would have to choose a position. Every quiet understanding we had built around the edges of this family, the ones that let us be in the same room without naming what everyone already knew, those would stop being possible. I stopped walking, stood at the corner, looked up at the streetlight catching the edge of the sidewalk. I had always been the one who kept things from getting bigger. Not because I thought it was right, because I thought it was kind. And I stood there long enough to feel the weight of that, what it had cost and what it had protected, and whether those 2 things had ever been equal. They hadn't. I exhaled and let the thought settle. This wasn't going to keep things intact. But the thing I had been trying to protect had already been taken apart. I just hadn't named it yet. I started walking again, slower. Not because I was hesitating, because I was deciding. And by the time I got back to my front door, I had, not calmly, clearly. I stopped guessing. I was ready to verify. I made the call the next morning at 8:19 before I could talk myself into waiting another day. The law office was in uptown Charlotte, on the 12th floor of a building that looked exactly like the kind of place where messy family stories went to get translated into neat folders and neutral language. Glass doors, brushed metal, a receptionist who smiled without curiosity. I gave my name, sat down, and waited. The waiting room smelled faintly like lemon polish and old paper. There were magazines on the table that no one actually read, and a framed print on the wall of the Charlotte skyline at sunset, all orange light and clean lines. Like the city had never held a single ugly conversation in its life. I sat with my bag in my lap and my shoulders square, not because I was nervous, but because I had finally reached the part where feelings were no longer useful. A man in a navy suit came out a few minutes later and introduced himself. Daniel Mercer, mid-40s, calm face, the kind of voice that made everything sound like it could be handled if people would just stop dramatizing it. That alone made me trust him more. He led me into his office, motioned for me to sit, and waited until I had taken the folder from my bag before he said anything. I laid out what I had, the fragment from the box, the messages, my notes, the timeline I had built the night before. I expected to feel self-conscious, like I was handing over scraps and guesses. I didn't. I felt prepared. He looked through everything without interrupting. No raised eyebrows. No sympathetic sighs. No little noises people make when they want you to know they are following along. Just attention. When he finally looked up, his expression had not changed. He folded his hands on the desk and asked the question so plainly it almost irritated me. Did you ever see the full document? Not a long lead-in. Not a careful explanation. Just that. I sat back slightly. No, I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. He nodded once, like that answer fit exactly where he expected it to. That matters. I almost laughed. Of course it mattered. At that point, it felt like every bad decision of my adult life could be traced back to not asking for the full document. He turned toward his computer, pulled up something on the screen, then reached into a file drawer beside his desk. When he brought out a thick manila folder and set it on the desk between us, I felt something in my chest tighten for the first time that day. Not fear. Recognition. This was real. He opened it carefully, like the contents were ordinary to him and only likely to matter to me. Page after page, typed and stamped and signed. Nothing dramatic, just paper. But paper has a way of ending arguments before they start. He slid the first section toward me and pointed to the header. My grandmother's trust, established in 2010. There it was in black ink, formal and unbending, the date sitting on the page like something carved into stone. For a second, all I could do was stare at it. My grandmother had built this years before any of the chaos that came later, before wedding clans, before family dinners turned into pressure campaigns, before Brianna learned how easily people let her take up space if she sounded sure enough. Daniel turned a few pages, then stopped. He didn't say anything right away, he just angled the document toward me. And that was when I saw my name, not buried, not vague, not implied. Caroline Hayes, right there on the page in clean, formal print. Below it were the words I had never seen before, the words no one had ever shown me, the words Brianna had apparently spent years hoping I would never read. Primary beneficiary. For a second, the room went silent in a way that felt almost physical. I could hear the air vent, a car horn somewhere 12 floors below, the faint shuffle of paper as Daniel adjusted another page. But inside me, everything narrowed to those two words. Primary beneficiary. I read the line again, then again. Like maybe the letters would rearrange themselves if I stared hard enough. They didn't. My name remained exactly where it was supposed to be. Not secondary, not discretionary, not grouped together with anyone else in a blur of shared entitlement. Primary. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. I should have felt triumphant, vindicated, angry. Instead, I felt something quieter, embarrassed maybe, not because of what the document said, but because of how long I had allowed someone else to narrate my own place in it. Daniel watched me for a moment and then said, very gently, "You are the principal recipient under the trust structure." That does not mean funds can be handled casually or immediately, but it does mean your sister does not have the authority she claimed. I looked up from the paper. Not the authority to suspend me. Correct. No flourish. No legal theater. Just one clean answer. I leaned back in the chair and pressed my fingertips together. Then, what exactly is she? He flipped to another page and tapped a different line. Acting trustee. I nodded slowly. That word I knew. Or I thought I did. I knew the version Brianna had turned into a crown. The version Dad repeated like it settled everything. The version Mom used to calm a room down before anyone asked the next logical question. Trustee. Daniel must have seen the look on my face because he added, that role carries responsibility, not ownership. It does not make the assets hers. It does not allow her to remove a beneficiary based on personal judgment. It certainly does not allow her to reframe the trust as personal spending money. I almost smiled at that last part. It was the most emotion I had heard from him so far. He went on, still measured. Trustees manage according to the document. They do not invent new rules because family dynamics change or because someone decides another person is difficult. Difficult. That word brushed up against everything Brianna had said at the reunion and made it sound even more absurd. I looked back at the page with my name on it. My grandmother's signature sat 3 sections earlier, strong and clear despite the years. I could almost see her hand moving across the paper, deliberate as ever. She had known exactly what she was doing, and somehow, all this time, I had let someone else tell me otherwise. I asked a question that had been sitting in the back of my throat since he first opened the folder. If this was always true, why wouldn't I have been shown the full document? He didn't answer immediately. That alone made me trust him more. Then he said, because private family trusts are often treated informally until someone asks the right questions. The trustee may handle the paperwork, communicate selectively, and present themselves as the gatekeeper. If no one pushes back, the structure becomes whatever the most assertive person says it is. That landed. Not because it was new information, but because it finally gave shape to something I had been feeling for years. Selective communication. Gatekeeper. Most assertive person. That was Brianna in a sentence. I sat very still for a moment, looking down at the pages. So she controlled the information, I said. Yes. And because she controlled the information, she controlled perception. Yes. And because she controlled perception, the rest of us just accepted the role we were handed. He didn't answer that one. He didn't need to. I thought about Mom smoothing the tablecloth, Dad staring straight ahead, Brianna standing in that room like she was reading from a script she believed no one could fact-check. Maybe she did believe it. Maybe after enough years of saying something out loud and not being challenged, it starts to feel like law. But that didn't make it true. Daniel turned one more section toward me. Asset history. Estimated value growth. Notes regarding administration. I didn't absorb every number. I didn't need to. The point wasn't the exact amount anymore. It was the structure, the fact that there was one. And that structure had never belonged to Brianna. I ran my finger lightly beneath my own name, then stopped. That small movement hit me harder than I expected. Physical proof always does. It is one thing to suspect. Another thing entirely to see yourself on a page that outlives everyone's opinion. I looked up at him again. So what happens next? He folded his hands once more. That depends on what you want. We can begin with a formal request for a full accounting. We can review records. We can determine whether the trustee acted within her authority, and if she didn't. His expression remained calm. Then there are remedies. That was as far as he took it, and I appreciated that. No dramatic promises, no fantasy of instant justice, just process. I nodded slowly. Okay. He turned another page, and this time his finger rested on a paragraph farther down. His eyes lifted to mine. There is one more thing. Of course there was. I felt my shoulders straighten slightly. He tapped the line once. Another clause. One people tend to ignore until it matters. I looked down, but the legal language blurred for a second before it sharpened again. My pulse had finally started to move, not fast. Just enough to remind me I was still in this room, and not floating somewhere above it. What kind of clause? The kind, he said, that determines what happens when a trustee uses funds in a way the document does not allow. The room seemed to get quieter, not because anything changed around us, because suddenly there was only that sentence. He turned the page fully toward me. There's another clause you need to understand. I read it once, then again, not because the language was complicated, because of what it implied. If a trustee used funds outside the scope of the trust, they could be required to return them. Personally, not through the trust, not through some shared family adjustment. Personally. I sat very still, my eyes moving slowly across the lines, letting the words settle into something real. Not dramatic, just inevitable. Daniel didn't rush me. He let the silence sit long enough for it to become clear. Then he said, if you want to proceed, the first step is a formal accounting. We request documentation of all transactions tied to the trust. I nodded. And if the numbers don't align, he held my gaze. Then we follow the structure the trust already defines. Structure, that word again, it was almost comforting. Because structure doesn't care about family dynamics. It doesn't adjust for feelings. It doesn't bend because someone is louder or more confident. It just exists. I left his office with a copy of the request already drafted. Clean language. Neutral tone. No accusation, just a question that required an answer. By the time I got back to my car, I didn't feel like I had started something. I felt like I had stepped into something that had been waiting. The email went out at 11:12 in the morning. I remember the time because I looked at it before I hit send. Subject line: request for full accounting. No emotion, no explanation, just clarity. I sat there for a second after sending it, watching the screen like something might immediately happen. Nothing did. Of course it didn't. Things like this don't move in bursts. They move in layers. I drove back to the office, parked, and walked in like any other day, because on the surface, it was emails, meetings, work that had nothing to do with any of this. But underneath that, something had shifted. At 1:43 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed. I didn't look at it right away. I finished the email I was working on, closed it, then picked up the phone, her name. I let it ring, then stop, then ring again. I watched it the way you watch something you already understand. Then it stopped. A few seconds later, a message came through. What is this? I read it once. Didn't respond. Another message. Why am I getting an accounting request? Still no response. A third. You seriously doing this? I set the phone down, turned it face down, went back to work, because there was nothing to say. Not yet. The next few hours passed quietly, which was interesting because I knew what would come next. Not from instinct, from pattern, denial, then adjustment, then pressure. At 4:20 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't her. An unfamiliar number. I answered. Hello. A woman's voice, polite but uncertain. Hi, I'm calling regarding the floral contract for the wedding. I paused, because that wasn't where I expected this to surface. She continued. We just need confirmation on the final payment source. There's been some confusion about which account is covering the balance. I leaned back in my chair. What kind of confusion? A small hesitation. We were told the trust account would be used, but the last transaction didn't process the way we expected. We just need clarity before we proceed. There it was. Not loud, not dramatic, but public, because this wasn't internal anymore. This was someone outside the family, someone who didn't know the unspoken rules, who didn't adjust their questions to avoid discomfort. They just asked. I kept my voice even. You'll need to follow up with the trustee. Another pause. Yes, that's what we're trying to do, she said. We just haven't been able to get a clear answer. Of course she hadn't. I ended the call shortly after that, set my phone down, and for the first time, I felt it. Not anger, pressure. Not on me, on her. Because now the questions weren't just coming from me, they were coming from places she couldn't control. At 5:30, I left the office. The drive home felt shorter than usual, or maybe I just wasn't paying attention to it. When I pulled into my driveway, my phone buzzed again. I didn't pick it up. Not yet. I went inside, set my bag down, and walked straight to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, took a sip, Then I checked. 7 missed calls, all from different numbers. And her messages, they had changed. The tone. It wasn't sharp anymore. It wasn't confident. It was shifting. This is unnecessary. You're misunderstanding how this works. We've always handled it this way. That one almost made me smile. Always. That word people use when they want something to feel permanent. Like history justifies everything. I scrolled further. Another message. This is going to complicate things for everyone. There it was, the pivot. From denial to pressure. Not about whether it was right, about whether it was convenient. I set the phone down again, walked over to the table, opened my laptop, added a new section to the timeline. Day 1, accounting requested. Day 1, vendor confusion. Day 1, trust usage questioned externally. I typed it out slowly, because this was the part where things started to surface. Not because I forced them, because they were already there, just waiting. At 7:15 in the evening, my phone buzzed again. I picked it up this time. Another unknown number. I answered, "Hello." This time, a different voice. Male. "We're reviewing payment confirmations for the venue," he said. "There is a discrepancy in the amount allocated versus what we were told to expect." I closed my eyes briefly, not from stress, from recognition, because it was happening exactly the way it always does when something isn't aligned. The edges start to show first, small, then larger. I gave the same answer. "You'll need to follow up with the trustee." He hesitated. "We've tried." I nodded, even though he couldn't see it. Then I would suggest continuing to do so. I ended the call, set the phone down, and stood there for a moment. The kitchen was quiet again. But it felt different, not still, active, like something had started moving that wasn't going to stop. I walked over to the table, sat down, and folded my hands together. I didn't feel overwhelmed. I didn't feel anxious. I felt certain. Because this wasn't about catching her in something. It was about letting the structure do what it was designed to do. Reveal. I picked up my phone again, looked at her messages. The last one had just come through. "Call me." No explanation, no justification, just urgency. I stared at it for a second, then set the phone back down. Because I knew what came next. Not from her, from everything else. Because once numbers don't align, they don't quietly fix themselves. They demand attention. They pull people in. They create pressure. And pressure reveals everything. I leaned back in my chair, exhaled slowly, and let the moment settle. That's when she started calling. Not once, not twice, constantly. The next morning, my phone lit up before I even got out of bed. Different numbers, same urgency. The pattern had shifted overnight. I didn't answer. I got up, made coffee, and let the phone buzz on the counter while the machine filled the pot with that slow, steady sound I had started to associate with clarity. By the time I sat down at the table, there were 11 missed calls, and one message from my dad, "Call your sister." Short, direct, no question. I stared at it for a second, then set the phone face down. Because that wasn't new either. Pressure from him always came packaged as instruction, not conversation. I opened my laptop instead, the timeline, added a new entry. Day 2, multiple contact attempts, family pressure initiated. I paused, then added another line. Emotional tone shift. From confidence to urgency. I closed the laptop and finished my coffee. I wasn't avoiding anything. I was letting it unfold. At 9:27 in the morning, Daniel emailed me. Follow-up request sent. Awaiting documentation. Clean, simple, expected. I replied with a single line. "Thank you. Please keep me updated." That was it. No questions, no elaboration. Because I didn't need to manage this part. That was the point. Around 10, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was my mom. I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered. "Hello." Her voice came through softer than usual. "Honey, what is going on?" I leaned back in my chair. "What do you mean?" A small pause. "Brianna said you sent something legal, something about the trust." Of course she had. I kept my voice even. I requested documentation. Another pause. Longer this time. "That feels extreme," she said carefully. "Extreme." I almost smiled. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I just asked for information. She exhaled softly. You know how she is. She's under a lot of pressure with the wedding. There it was again, the explanation, the softening, the adjustment. I looked at the papers on the table, then back at nothing in particular. That doesn't change how the trust works. Silence. Then, quieter. This is going to create problems. I nodded slightly, even though she couldn't see it. That depends on what's already there. She didn't respond to that, because she knew, or at least part of her did. The call ended without resolution, like always. I set the phone down and sat there for a moment, not frustrated, just aware. Because even now, she wasn't asking what was true, she was asking how to make it easier. By 11:30, things had moved beyond calls and messages. I received an email from one of the vendors. Subject line: Urgent clarification required. I opened it. We are unable to proceed without confirmation of funds. The amounts previously discussed do not match current authorization. I read it once, then again. Same pattern. Different source. I forwarded it to Daniel. No comment. Because the pattern was speaking for itself now. By early afternoon, I got another message. Not from Brianna, from someone I recognized, her fiancé. Short, can you talk? I stared at it for a second. Then I replied, I can meet. We agreed on a time, 3:15, at the venue. Of course it was there. Because this wasn't just internal anymore, this was public. I arrived 5 minutes early. The place was exactly what you would expect. High ceilings, neutral tones, everything designed to look expensive without being specific. Brianna was already there, standing near a table with a few folders spread out in front of her. Her posture was different, still controlled, but tighter, less fluid. Her fiancé stood beside her, arms crossed, his expression neutral but not relaxed. A vendor was across from them. I recognized her voice from the phone call the day before. And then they saw me. Brianna's eyes locked onto mine immediately. There it was. Not confidence. Something sharper, something closer to strain. You came, she said. Not relief, not welcome, just acknowledgement. I nodded once. The vendor looked between us. Good, she said. Maybe we can clear this up. She reached for one of the folders. We were told the trust would cover these expenses, but the account details we have don't match the authorizations we're receiving now. She looked at Brianna. Can you confirm the source of funds? Simple question. Clear. Brianna smiled. That same smile. But it didn't hold, it flickered. Of course, she said. It's being handled. The vendor didn't move. How? A pause. Just long enough to matter. Brianna shifted slightly. We're working through a minor adjustment. Minor. I watched her closely, because this was the first time I had seen her without complete control of the narrative. Her fiancé spoke then. What kind of adjustment? His tone wasn't aggressive. It was uncertain. That was new. Brianna turned to him. It's nothing. Just timing. Timing. The vendor glanced at me briefly, then back at Brianna. We need confirmation today. Otherwise, we can't proceed with the final arrangements. There it was. Not family, not emotion. Process. Deadline. Structure. The same thing I had stepped into. Brianna's hands moved slightly on the table, just enough to give it away. She didn't have the answer. Not the kind that held up outside of our family. She looked at me then. For the first time, not as someone she was managing, as someone who had something she didn't. You didn't need to escalate this, she said quietly. I held her gaze. I didn't respond. Because this wasn't a conversation between us anymore. The vendor cleared her throat. So we're not able to confirm. Silence. Heavy. Real. Her fiancé exhaled slowly. Brianna. His voice was different now, not aligned, questioning. She turned to him. I said, I'm handling it. The words came out sharper than before. Too sharp. Because now they weren't landing on people who accepted them without question. They were landing on people who needed proof. He didn't look convinced. What does that mean? Another pause. Longer this time. I watched it happen. Not dramatically, not all at once, just slowly. The control she had built through certainty and repetition started to slip. Because the structure didn't support it. Because the numbers didn't match. Because the questions were no longer optional. She looked back at the vendor. We'll resolve it, she said. The vendor nodded, but not in agreement, in acknowledgement. that the answer hadn't been given, that the problem still existed. I stepped back slightly, not physically, mentally, because I didn't need to push this. It was already moving. Brianna looked at me again. There was something different in her eyes now. Not anger, not confidence. Something I hadn't seen before. Confusion. Genuine. Like she was running through a logic she had trusted for years and couldn't find where it had broken. She had managed the trust. She had made the calls. She had kept things moving while no one else paid attention. In her version of this, that was the same as authority. Maybe it had always been. That was the part that almost made me feel something. Not sympathy. Recognition. Because she wasn't pretending the document said something different. She genuinely didn't understand why it mattered. Why primary beneficiary meant something that couldn't be overridden by years of showing up. By being useful. By being the one who handled things. She had mistaken labor for ownership. For so long that the difference had disappeared. Her fiancé shook his head slightly, looking between us. I thought this was already taken care of. No one answered him. Because no one could. The room felt smaller, not because anything changed, because the illusion had. And once that's gone, everything else feels exposed. I picked up my bag, no rush, no statement, just movement. No one stopped me. No one asked me to stay, because there was nothing left for me to do there. As I walked toward the door, I heard her voice again, quieter this time. Tight, we'll fix this. I didn't turn around. Because for the first time, it wasn't about what she said, it was about what she couldn't. I stepped outside into the late afternoon light. The air felt warmer than it had that morning. Or maybe I just noticed it more. I walked to my car, unlocked it, and sat down, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, same as before. But everything was different. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel victorious. I felt certain. Because control isn't something you declare. It's something that holds under pressure, and hers didn't. I started the engine, pulled out of the parking lot, and let the road carry me forward. For the first time, she wasn't in control anymore, and once that started, it didn't reverse. It unfolded, quietly at first, then all at once. 3 weeks after the meeting at the venue, Daniel called me at 9:02 in the morning. I was at my desk, halfway through reviewing a report, when my phone buzzed. I picked up immediately. We received the full accounting, he said. No build-up, no pause, just the next step. I leaned back in my chair. And a small pause on his end this time. There are discrepancies. Of course there were. He didn't list them all. He didn't need to. He summarized. Unauthorized use of funds, multiple transactions, personal expenditures tied to the wedding and home furnishings. I closed my eyes briefly, not because I was overwhelmed, because I was confirming something I already knew, the total. I opened my eyes. He said the number slowly. Between $25,000 and $30,000. Spent. Not managed, not allocated. Spent. I nodded once, even though he couldn't see it. And the clause. We're proceeding with enforcement. Clear. Clean. Final. By the end of that week, everything shifted. Not in a dramatic explosion. In a series of very precise corrections. Brianna was formally removed as trustee. The language in the document made it simple. Objective. She had acted outside the scope. That was enough. A replacement was assigned. Temporary. Independent. Neutral. The trust didn't collapse. It stabilized. That was the part no one ever talks about. They expect chaos. What they get is structure. And structure doesn't care who you thought you were. It only cares what you did. The repayment process started immediately. Not a discussion. Not a negotiation. A requirement. Funds returned. Personally. Not through the trust, not through anyone else. That was the clause, the one she never expected to matter. I didn't call her. I didn't need to. Because by then, the silence had already shifted. It wasn't avoidance anymore. It was distance. Intentional. And understood. The wedding didn't stop. But it changed. You could see it in the details. The scale adjusted. The tone shifted. Vendors became more careful, more direct. Because once a payment issue surfaces, it doesn't disappear. It follows everything. I heard about it through people who weren't trying to tell me anything, just talking. The venue required additional verification. The florist scaled back arrangements. The photographer requested full payment upfront, small things. But they added up. And people noticed, her fiancé noticed. That was the part that mattered. Because uncertainty doesn't stay contained, it spreads. I saw him once. Not planned. At a coffee shop in South End. He looked different. Not angry, not even upset, just recalculating. He saw me. Walked over. There was a pause before he spoke. I didn't know, he said. I nodded. I believe you. That was it. No accusation, no alliance, just truth. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. I didn't ask about the wedding. He didn't offer, because we both knew it wasn't about the event anymore. It was about what had been revealed around it. Over the next few weeks, the calls stopped. The messages stopped. The urgency faded, because there was nothing left to manage. The structure had taken over, and it didn't need her version of the story. It had its own. My dad called once, left a voicemail. We should talk. I didn't call back. Not out of anger, out of clarity. Because I already knew what that conversation would be. An attempt to smooth, to reframe, to move forward without addressing what actually happened. And I wasn't interested in that anymore. My mom took longer, she always did. Her silence stretched out, not empty, just waiting. Until one afternoon, about 2 months after everything started, my phone rang. Her name. I answered. Hello. Her voice was softer than I remembered, not weak, careful. Hi. A pause. Then, I was hoping you could help me with something. There it was. Not an apology, not acknowledgement, a request. I didn't respond right away. I let the silence sit, on both ends. Because that silence, that was something she understood. Better than words. It's just, things have been a little tight lately, she continued. And I thought maybe you could. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I looked out the window. The same street, the same quiet. Everything normal. And completely different. I thought about all the times I had stepped in, without being asked directly, without being acknowledged after, because it was easier, because it kept things moving, because it was expected. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel resentful. I felt clear, and for the first time, I mirrored her. Not her words, her behavior. I didn't fill the silence. I didn't soften it. I didn't make it easier. I just let it be. She waited. Then she said my name, softly, like she always did when she wanted something to land. I didn't answer. Not with words. Because this time, the silence said everything I had spent years trying to explain. She exhaled, a small sound. Then, okay, the call ended. I sat there for a moment afterward, not processing, just present. She hadn't apologized. I didn't think she would. Not because she didn't feel something. I think she did. But because apology would have required naming what had happened, and naming it would have meant she had seen it all along. I wasn't sure she had. That was the thing I had been sitting with for weeks. Not whether my mother loved me, that had never been the question, but whether she had watched all of it, the reunion, the tablecloth, the silence, and understood what she was doing, or whether she had only ever been managing the room, keeping things smooth, not seeing because seeing would have made smoothing impossible. I didn't know which one it was. Maybe she didn't either. And I had finally reached the point where I could hold the not knowing, without needing to resolve it into something cleaner. She had adjusted, for the first time. That was real. Whether it meant she understood, or only that she finally felt the resistance, I couldn't tell. But I had stopped needing to. That was the shift. Not loud, not dramatic, just permanent. I went back to the table, sat down, and looked at the papers again. The full document now. Not fragments, not interpretations. Clear. Complete. My name's still there. Exactly where it had always been. Nothing added. Nothing taken away. I ran my hand lightly across the page. Not because I needed to check. Because I could. Because for the first time, I wasn't relying on someone else to tell me what was mine. I understood it. On my own. I didn't feel like celebrating. There was no moment of triumph, no sense of winning, just resolution. Because this had never been about taking something back. It had been about seeing it clearly, about stepping out of a role I had never agreed to play, about understanding the difference between what someone says you are allowed to have and what is already yours. I leaned back in my chair and let the quiet settle around me. The house felt different again, not empty, not tense, just mine. And I thought about that night at the reunion, the way she stood there, certain, confident. You don't deserve a dime. I almost smiled. Not because I needed to prove her wrong, because she already had, without realizing it. What was never hers to take had never actually left. It had just been hidden behind someone else's voice. And once that voice lost control, everything else fell back into place.